Hello, I'm Dr. Kurt Sander, and welcome back to Music Theory Simplified. We have a lot to talk about today. Today's lesson is all about the concept of prolongation and how we can stretch out the influence of a particular harmony over time through the use of second inversion or 6/4 chords. Now we'll get to that word prolongation in a minute. It's a somewhat tricky concept to understand. For now, let's review what we know about second inversion triads. A 6/4 chord is simply a triad that has the fifth in the lowest voice. What that does is it creates a very unstable sound. The reason for this is because of the intervals of the sixth and fourth, which are created when the triad is in second inversion. These are less stable than the intervals we find in a root position triad, the fifth and the third. In tonal music, it's the fluctuation of stable and unstable intervals or harmonies that propels the musical line forward. Now here's where it gets a little bit tricky. Our notion of stability and instability has a lot to do with how we hear an interval or a harmony in terms of its dissonance or consonance. We base this on the acoustical phenomenon of the overtone series. The lower notes of the overtone series, the lower partials, sound less dissonant to our ears, and the higher up you get in terms of those overtones, the more dissonant it sounds. What that means for our purposes is that the octave, fifth, and third sound the most stable or the least dissonant to our ears. Think back to our lesson on harmonic grammar and how we could categorize harmonies into three different types: tonic, subdominant or predominant, and dominant. What prolongation means is that we can take a zone that's dedicated to, for example, the tonic harmonies, and we can stretch that out through a fluctuation of dissonance and consonance, or more stable intervals or less stable intervals. Now I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking, well, this is music theory simplified, and all of this is not sounding very simple to my ears. Well, let's use a musical example to show you what I mean. In many cases, it's easier to understand what something is by looking at its opposite. So before we look at prolongation in music, let's look at examples where the intent is not to stretch out harmony, but rather to articulate harmonies like tonic and dominant in close succession, in order to create a sense of power and urgency. The music of Beethoven is considered some of the best in the world. Let's take a look at the end of the first movement of his Fifth Symphony to see what we're talking about here with root position tonic-dominant chords. Here are the last few measures of the first movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony in C minor. The red squares here represent C minor tonic triads in root position, and the blue squares here are G major dominant triads in root position. What I want you to listen for is the immediacy, the impact of these root position tonic dominant triads in close succession. So clearly, Beethoven's not being very subtle here. He's giving us these root position tonic and dominant chords over and over again to deliberately have a strong impact on how we experience the end of this movement. There's not a whole lot of prolongation going on here. But there may be times when we don't want our music to sound that forceful, and we want it to unfold in a gradual kind of way. Well, here's where prolongation can really help. If you've studied music theory for any length of time, or maybe studied counterpoint, you will know that there are things that we call in music non-chord tones or non-harmonic tones. These are those notes in the melody or in some other voice that don't fit the underlying harmony, and their purpose is to kind of connect chord to chord. Let me show you what I mean. Here we have two tonic triads in root position. Now this is not a very interesting progression. It's simply two chords, and while the tonic is stretched out, it doesn't have a sense of motion. But if we were to add a non-chord tone, perhaps a neighbor tone in the soprano voice, because we've added an element of dissonance, the fourth, between the F and the C below it, there's a sense of departure and return to this tonic triad. Now I know it's not much, but by adding this little bit of dissonance, we've created a sense of tension and release, which helps us to prolong that tonic chord. But let's not stop there. Let's add another upper neighbor tone to the alto voice. And you can see that this A is not part of the C major chord, and a sixth is less stable than a fifth. Now here's what it sounds like. Now here's an interesting thing. If we analyze this chord, we can see that we've created a new harmony, an F major chord with C in the lowest voice. While you might want to label this a 4-6-4, remember this is a second inversion triad, and they're very unstable. They really don't sound like the Roman numerals that we label them with. Here's where music theorists will often put parentheses around the 6-4 chord and refer to it as a neighbor 6-4 chord because of that upper neighboring motion in the upper voices. But the point of this exercise is not to get caught up on labels, but to see that introducing dissonance or instability can prolong the sense of a triad, in this case the 1 chord. Let's go back to our 1 chord that was repeated and look at other ways that we can prolong this tonic triad. Another way composers will extend or prolong the influence of a harmonic zone is to use the inversion of a particular chord to create variety. Here we have a 1 going to a 1-6. Note that all we've done is exchanged root to third in the bass and third to root in the soprano. Here's what it sounds like. So by utilizing a different version of the same triad, we've created interest, and thus we've prolonged that harmonic plane. Now let's add the dissonance that we learned about in the first example. Let's add a non-harmonic tone in the soprano, a dissonant passing tone that creates a second with the lower C. Just like the neighbor tones in the first example, this passing tone gives us a sense of departure and return, or embellishment of this 1 chord. But what if we added more dissonance, more departure and return? What if we added a lower neighbor tone in the tenor voice, creating the dissonance of a 7th with the bass? Here's what that would sound like. Well, that kind of works, but something's still missing. What if we took the bass and filled in that third with a passing tone? It creates a dissonance of the 4th with one of the upper voices. Now let's take a listen to it. Now that sounds pretty good, but wait a minute. Just like before, when we've added a number of non-chord tones, we've ended up creating a different harmony altogether. Just like before, you might be tempted to call this a 5-6-4, but remember, second inversion triads are unstable. They rarely sound like the Roman numeral that we label them with. So music theorists will often put parentheses around this chord as well, and refer to this as a passing 6-4 chord. Now let's get to the moment we've been waiting for, talking about how we can, at the end of a phrase, extend the sense of the dominant to kind of prolong the tension that we know is inherent in the tonic-dominant relationship. And we do this, and we find it most often done in music through the use of what we call a cadential 6/4 closure, or a cadential 6/4 going to a 5 chord. Let me show you how this is done. Here we have a full harmonic progression ending with 1-7-1. And for this harmonization, we've just used a simple 1 chord. Let's listen to what this sounds like. While it's an okay progression, there's something not quite right about those last 3 chords. Let's look at the harmony at work. The opening chords all seem to prolong the sense of tonic. Even though they're different chords, they tend to all gravitate around 1. In the middle section of this progression, we have a subdominant prolongation, a 4 going to a 2 diminished 6, which, as you know, are very similar chords. At the end, it would be logical to expect a dominant chord, but instead it's interrupted by a tonic going to a dominant. It almost sounds like we've taken a step backwards. So let's get rid of that note, and instead let's replace it with another D, the root of that 5 chord. An analysis of this chord shows that it's a 1-6-4 chord. But just like in the 2 previous examples, second inversion triads are unstable things. They don't really sound like the Roman numeral that we use to label them. So here's another case where theorists will often change the label to show that this really isn't a 1-6-4, it's more a prolongation of the dominant, the 5 chord. Here's the label they often use. Before we get into the reasons why they do this, let's listen to the progression and hear what it sounds like. I don't know about you, but I think that sounds a whole lot better than the first version. So the question is, why is a 1-6-4 serving as a prolongation of a dominant harmony? Aren't tonic and dominant 2 completely different harmonic functions? Well, the answer has to go back to the idea of hearing instability. And if you recall the first 2 6/4 chords that we looked at, they were based on unstable or dissonant elements. The first was the neighbor 6/4, which gets its name from the 2 neighbor tone motions that are occurring in the upper voices. And the second is the passing 6/4, which gets its name from the way that the bass note passes between 2 notes that are a third apart. In each of these cases, there's an element of instability and dissonance, which resolves or leads to a moment of stability or consonance. So if the first chord that we looked at functions much like a neighbor tone, and the second chord we looked at functions much like a passing tone, how is this cadential 6/4 functioning? The word for this in music is an appoggiatura. An appoggiatura is simply an accented dissonance that resolves downward by step to a consonance. So we see that the cadential 6/4 exactly does this. The cadential 6/4 always occurs on the strong beat, and it always involves 2 voices that are unstable on that stressed beat, which resolve downward by step to a more stable sonority of the dominant. Let's take a closer look at this and see what's actually happening. Here's a cadential 6/4 in G minor. It's important to note that for every 6/4 chord, every second inversion chord, you double the 5th of the chord. So here's a G, that's the root, here's the B flat, that's the 3rd, and the D is doubled. We do this in order to strengthen the sense of 5. It provides a root-like stability. So in writing the 6/4 chord, you maintain those 2 common tones, and the other 2 voices move down by step. One goes from the 6th to the 5th, and the other from the 4th to the 3rd. So going back to our original progression, we can see that this cadential 6/4 functions like a double appoggiatura. The two unstable intervals of the 6th and the 4th move to the 5th and 3rd. It's almost as if this is like a parachute, slowing us down to the final cadence at the end. And this really is an ideal analogy, because that's exactly what's happening. We are prolonging the dominant. Let's try a different key. Here in the key of D major, we have a 5. The best approach for writing a cadential 6/4 is to write the 5 first, and then delay the resolution to the 5th and 3rd by writing notes a 6th and a 4th above the bass. Now that you know how to write the 6/4, let's look at examples from the literature. Here's an example from the Requiem of Cherubini. Notice the 1/6/4 has that classic double appoggiatura effect. Let's hear this parachute in action. Another good example is by Bruckner, his Tantum Ergo, where you can see the cadential 6/4 in the first bar of the second system. Again, we find that the dominant holds, while notes a 6th and 4th above resolve downward to the 5th and 3rd. What an incredibly beautiful yet simple composition this is. And I think it exemplifies how we can use prolongation to sustain and stretch out these areas of harmonic influence. Now, as I promised, we packed a lot into today's lesson, and the idea of prolongation is not something that comes easily right away. So if you don't get it all right now, hopefully over time you will. The main important thing to understand here is that the cadential 6/4 closure is a method of prolonging and sustaining the influence of the dominant, much like a parachute, before it resolves to the tonic. So that's the main takeaway from this lesson, and to be able to know how to write that cadential 6/4 closure, which emphasizes this idea of stretching out the dominant. Well, that's all the time we have for today's lesson, and this is Dr. Sander always reminding you to keep it simple.